The original fire attack study examined interior and exterior suppression on first floor bedroom fires. The report described best practices for an exterior suppression action in two phases: surface cooling and fuel wetting. By cooling the surfaces with water from a hose stream, energy feedback to both hot gases and pyrolyzing materials is reduced. Reducing the heat feedback to the fuels can slow the burning rate. Reducing the temperature of gases leads to gas contraction. The combined effects reduce the hazard in the fire compartment and make it easier for firefighters to complete suppression. In the laboratory experiments conducted as part of the fire attack study, these surface cooling and fuel wetting actions, particularly during exterior suppression actions, were conducted separately. While fuel wetting reduced the likelihood of regrowth following exterior suppression in these laboratory experiments, it also highlighted an important knowledge gap. The nozzle in the window application recommended would be impractical on a similar fire occurring on the second floor. To address this gap, the difference in regrowth potential between the experiments in Method 3, a second floor bedroom fire with exterior suppression, and Method 6, a first floor kitchen fire with exterior suppression, can be compared. Let's take a look at what we discovered. In Method 3, the exterior suppression action consisted of a 10-second straight stream application at a steep angle off the ceiling of the fire room. In Method 6, the exterior suppression actions consisted of a 10-second straight stream application at a steep angle off the ceiling of the fire room, followed by a fuel wetting action, where water was applied through the fire room window in an O pattern. In both methods, the entry of the suppression crew was delayed by 60 seconds following suppression to simulate a delay in repositioning the line and allowing assessment of the potential for fire regrowth following exterior suppression. The additional fuel wetting conducted in the first floor kitchen experiments had a notable impact on the regrowth potential of the kitchen fires. As you see here, temperatures in the kitchen in experiments 18, 19, and 20 continuously decreased following exterior suppression. Only in experiment 20 did the 7-foot, 11-inch temperature begin to increase prior to suppression. While we did not see regrowth after exterior suppression in the first floor kitchen experiments, we did see regrowth in each second floor bedroom experiment. As you see here, temperatures close to the ceiling in the hallway began to increase less than 1 minute after exterior suppression in all three experiments. In experiment 12, this regrowth resulted in hallway temperatures in excess of 600 degrees from the 4-foot level to the ceiling and visible flames as the suppression crew reached the fire room door. The potential for regrowth in scenarios where fuel wetting is not possible reinforces the importance of a rapid transition to the interior after the initial exterior water application. We know that regrowth is directly related to a continued increase in toxic and thermal exposure to occupants. Thus, minimizing the time from completing exterior fire control to interior extinguishment is critical. One way to limit the time required for the transition to interior operations is to use one handline for the exterior water application and deploy a second handline to the point of entry. This two-line approach could be particularly practical when the location of exterior suppression is remote from the point of entry. If entry into the structure is delayed for any reason, suppression crews must recognize the potential for regrowth and be prepared to flow on their approach to the fire room. The extent of this regrowth may be difficult to assess before entry, and thermal conditions may worsen in the time it takes to advance from the front door to the fire room. Now let's hear from our technical panel.
It is the potential for effective or ineffective exterior water application. And I think the thing that we really take away from this study is the fact that that thought of pulling that line to the Bravo Charlie corner and readdressing that line to that front door is really impractical and slow. And so if you have the ability with your staffing, your manpower, your hose set up on your rig, and you have the ability to leave that line in place, we're seeing that over the course of a minute, 2 minutes, you're seeing that increase in regrowth. And if we weren't effective in our stream on the water application from that exterior, that need to be getting inside and flowing water and getting water on the fuels was extremely important. Regardless of your tactic of choice from the beginning, if your initial tactic of choice is exterior water, the operation does not stop there. That there's absolutely a necessary need to get your bodies into space to ensure base fire extinguishment, to put out the hidden fires, and to ensure that the fire's out from the interior.
Face it, not everybody has the luxury of adequate staffing, if there is such a thing. But if you have a very limited personnel situation, that may be a reality for you. If you're arriving with one or two firefighters on an apparatus and your backup may be more than a few minutes out, that's something that you may need to take into consideration. So if exterior water is going to be a more viable option for your particular agency, or is a viable option for the situation that you're confronted with, and you've deemed that it's going to have the best possible outcome for the victims and for the property you're trying to save, then at least make sure that it's being done so we can get the most return on investment.
The difference in regrowth between the second floor bedroom fire experiments and first floor kitchen fire experiments can be attributed to the difference in the effectiveness of the exterior suppression actions. In both scenarios, the straight stream steep angle application cooled gases within the space. For the first floor exterior suppression, the combination of the gas cooling and the ability of the crew to then move the nozzle directly to the vent to wet the fuels by whipping the nozzle with a half-open bail was effective at removing energy from the fire room and inhibiting additional fire growth. In the second floor experiments, this additional fuel wetting was impractical. The straight stream steep angle application cooled gases within the space, resulting in decreased temperatures, but the inability to effectively wet the pyrolyzing fuels results in an increased potential for regrowth. In cases where fuel wetting is limited or initial fire control is not effective, it is important to minimize the time between initial exterior fire control actions and subsequent interior actions. Use this menu to navigate the content in this section. The results of the fire attack study emphasize that effective suppression actions, whether from the exterior or the interior of the structure, must get water into the fire room. Whether interior or exterior, fire streams cool surfaces that they can reach. While exterior water application may occur through either a window or a door with direct access to the fire compartment, interior suppression actions, remote from the fire room, may be hampered by walls and other obstructions, which break up hose streams and make them less effective. These remote suppression actions, such as flowing and moving down a hallway, may not always impact fire room temperatures, but are often necessary in order to cool adjacent spaces to the fire room to allow the suppression crews advance. Even though the floor plans in the acquired structures used in this project differed from those in laboratory structures, similar trends were observed. Let's take a closer look. As you can see, the impact of remote suppression actions on the temperature in the fire room varied. In each experiment, the average fire room temperature before suppression was over 1200 degrees. In 7 out of the 10 interior attack experiments, the suppression action which resulted in the most significant reduction in fire room temperatures was water application from the doorway of the fire room. In these experiments, initial suppression actions from outside the fire room had a limited impact on fire room temperatures, primarily because of the difficulty in effectively applying water into the fire room from these positions. In the remaining 3 experiments, firefighters could apply water directly into the fire room from a remote location. Thus, temperatures decreased. These temperature decreases were not permanent, however, and complete extinguishment was not achieved until the suppression crew advanced into the fire room. Let's take a closer look at Experiment 3. In this experiment, the nozzle firefighter was positioned in the stairway and directed the hose stream through the banister directly into the fire room. In addition, the second suppression position from the top of the stairs also allowed direct water application into the fire room. Although each of these suppression actions decreased the average temperature in the fire room by more than 250 degrees, the temperatures leveled off in the 35-second period between the end of the water application from the stairway landing and the start of the water application from the doorway of the fire room. While initial suppression remote from the fire room reduced temperatures in both the stairway landing and the fire room, the fire continued to grow, allowing flames to extend into the hallway. This experiment reinforces that while remote water application can be effective in providing local cooling, suppression in the fire room is essential to ensure extinguishment. Now, let's hear from our technical panel.
I think that was one of the eye-opening revelations that I had from not only the water mapping study but the coordinated fire attack study is just kind of that lentil hit or the jam hit, and how we can just start getting water into that compartment as quickly as possible. I think traditionally there's an article that Alan Brunacini wrote a long time ago called Fast, Wet, and Close, and I think that was the mindset that we had as firefighters, at least as I was being brought up in the fire service, is that you have to get there fast and you have to get up close and spray a bunch of water. And now we're starting to understand that the reach of our stream and the velocity that it has bouncing off surfaces, creating droplets and getting it into that compartment is really the priority. So we don't have to be close anymore. We have the technology and the equipment that allows us to really utilize the reach of our stream, and now we just need the education and the training to implement it and to make it useful for us.
Our equipment to its full potential, and as you say, the reach of the stream is everything when it comes to this. So when you look at the average fire stream, I mean, you're looking at 40 plus feet of reach. Now you put that in the context of a superheated environment, and yes, that's going to be less. But if in the context of most of the dwellings that we're going to be operating in, that's more than enough reach that we need to go from one end of a hallway to another, or across even as big of a room as a living room, even in an open floor plan. So you're going to be able to get the water where it needs to go, but it's also important to remember that it's line of sight. So that we need to set ourselves up so we get the best angle of approach so we can get water on the seat of the fire as quick as possible.
In general, the suppression crew achieved the most significant reduction in fire room temperatures once they began applying water from the fire room doorway. Remote suppression can also be effective, depending on the layout of the structure, but regrowth was possible if suppression from the fire room was delayed. Whenever possible, consider using the reach of your hose stream to apply water into the fire room, realizing that complete suppression will not be possible until you can reach the fire room. Even if it is not possible to get water directly into the fire room, remote suppression should be used to cool as you make your advance to the fire room. Use this menu to navigate the content in this section. Many variables inform the decision of where to place a vertical ventilation hole. Previous research in a laboratory setting suggested that ventilating over the fire is the best choice if your attack is coordinated. We know that a ventilation-limited fire will increase in size if it receives air, and that the closer the source of the air is to the seat of the fire, the quicker the fire will grow. The results of these experiments in acquired structures supported that vertical ventilation occurring before suppression on a ventilation-limited bedroom fire resulted in fire growth. But this fire growth did not always translate to an increase in thermal conditions outside of the fire room. Let's take a look at some examples. In experiment 7, even though only 42 seconds elapsed between opening the front door and water application into the fire room, and only 30 seconds elapsed between vertical ventilation over the fire room and water application into the fire room, a temperature increase was measured, indicating fire growth as a result of the increased air entrainment. It is important to note that the fire growth did not result in a measurable deterioration in conditions outside the fire room because of the close coordination of suppression with vertical ventilation. In this case, the initial water application occurred within 30 seconds of opening the front door. Completion of vertical ventilation caused gas concentrations and temperatures close to the floor in remote areas of the structure to decrease. Locations closest to the inlet portion of the flow path received the most immediate positive benefit, indicating that the fresh air entrained into the stairway following the opening of the front door and completion of the vertical vent decreased the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and increased the oxygen at that location. Visibility improved in the intake portion of the flow path between the front door and the fire room. The vertical ventilation study also suggested that ventilating remote from the fire can be effective under some circumstances. For example, if the fire is in a room connected to the rest of the house by a doorway, ventilating the roof outside that room could allow smoke to clear from the rest of the house. However, while visibility may improve in the flow path leading from the air inlet to the fire room, the fire will increase in size as the air is entrained. The doorway becomes the limiting factor in keeping the fire contained. Let's look at an example from the experiments in acquired structures. In experiment 8, the fire was located in a second floor bedroom, and a vertical ventilation opening was made in the hallway immediately outside the fire room. Because the vertical vent hole was adjacent to the doorway, the fire began to extend out of the fire room doorway and into the low-pressure vent in the hallway. Water flow in the stairway was initiated 12 seconds after the vertical vent hole was completed. Therefore, the fire extension into the hallway did not deteriorate conditions remote from the fire room. Thus, while vertical ventilation caused fire growth in both pre-suppression vertical ventilation experiments, the prompt water application by the suppression crew quickly controlled and extinguished the fire. This emphasizes the importance of communication between suppression crews and crews performing vertical ventilation to avoid unwanted or unexpected fire growth. Now let's hear from our technical panel.
Biggest takeaways that I took from those experiments in particular was there was this misconception, if you will, that vertical ventilation in the experiments 7 and 8, vertical ventilation directly over the fire was going to always have this global lifting effect of the fire floor, when in reality it's completely hinges on the availability of the inlets, because it's all about the exchange. Oftentimes when we talk about ventilation, it's typically a one-sided argument where we focus on exhausting the venting and the extracting of the byproducts of combustion. But in order for that air exchange to take place, there has to be that proportionate intake to replace what you're letting out. And that's, for me, when viewing those experiments, and there's a tremendous diagram that shows this within the study, but that lifting effect was only, or that exchange was only taking place between the intake, which was the front door for that particular experiment, and the fire room, which had the open windows and then the vertical ventilation directly above. But as you touched on, what's occurring in those two remote bedrooms, that even though they're directly off the hallway, and even though the doors are open to that hallway, because the windows are still intact within those two spaces, there is no source of intake, so there's no air exchange taking place. So where this plays into is, if we're resource limited and we're trying to prioritize tactics, it's fire attack and primary search are our two primaries. Ventilation's a support function. While yes, it is part of that trinity of tactics that are our mainstays, ventilation's a support function. It's designed to support fire attack effort, and it's designed to support victim survivability. So if you need to look at what's going to have the highest return on investment.
Vertical ventilation functions by creating an additional exhaust vent above the fire, which subsequently increases air entrainment through other ventilation openings in the structure. If firefighters are operating along this inlet flow path, they may temporarily feel cooling as a result of the increased air entrainment. It is important to recognize, however, that this improvement in conditions is limited primarily to the inlet flow path and is temporary. The results of these experiments showed that the magnitude of this improvement is dependent on both vent hole location and the timing of ventilation. If pre-suppression vertical ventilation is not followed closely by suppression, temperatures will begin to increase due to additional fire growth from the entrained air. Use this menu to navigate the content in this. An important consideration in any incident is life safety, and in particular, the safety of any occupant that may be trapped within the structure. Therefore, in this project and the fire attack study, occupant assessment packages were located throughout the structure to evaluate tenability. As stated in the Impact of Fire Attack Utilizing Interior and Exterior Streams on Firefighter Safety and Occupant Survival, Full-Scale Experiments report, the survivability of an occupant is dependent on their exposure to heat and toxic gases, their proximity to the fire location, and their elevation within the space. The experiments conducted as part of this project supported the same general trend observed in previous research. Just as seen in past experiments, thermal exposure was greatest near the fire and toxic exposure was greatest at higher elevations, illustrating the importance of proximity and elevation when considering occupant tenability. Click the icon to explore the data from these experiments, or click Next to continue. Now let's hear from our technical panel. Is interesting about this is that it shows that, number one, there are absolutely survivable spaces on arrival in our experiments, but that toxic hazard continues to increase, in many cases, even after ventilation and suppression have already been initiated. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the data, backs up a lot of the things that common sense would tell you. Obviously, the closer the victim is to that fire room, the higher elevation they are, the more of an exposure that they're going to have. I think traditionally, at least in my mind, I had the idea that once we started putting water on the fire or ventilating, it was getting much better right now. And I think there's a residual impact that we're having on these victims well after extinguishment and throughout ventilation that we need to be cognizant of, because there are survivable spaces upon arrival, and that window is quickly closing throughout all of our interactions from the initial one until the final one. So I think obviously getting victims to a place where their exposure is limited, whether that's isolating a room and ventilating locally or whether that's getting them out of the structure, I think it needs to be the priority. It really creates a very important decision for you as you arrive, making that offensive versus defensive declaration. From the street, maybe 50 feet away, only seeing 2 or 3 sides. Typically, if you have fire blowing out of multiple openings, there's departments that would call that defensive. But now we're starting to realize that there is searchable space, and I like how you said that instead of survivable space. There is searchable space. So I think the consideration that I would tell my people is maybe we do a 360 and we get all eyes around that, and we get in and we search areas that we can before we kind of write that building and any potential victims in that building off. I think they deserve that
determine is what's searchable. And then getting in and occupying those areas that are most severely threatened and working our way back and completing that primary search in order to get to and remove those victims as soon as possible. Because I like to use the analogy of radiological incidents. It's everything is time, distance, and shielding, and that's a perfect analogy for describing the insult to victims in the fire area, which is obviously the longer duration that they're subjected to these insults, the worse it's going to be for them. But it's also the distance, not only from the fire itself, but also distance from the floor, because the higher the elevation, it could in some cases almost be just as impactful as their proximity to the fire, as far as the gas concentrations go.
The presence of exterior smoke and fire upon arrival are not a reliable indicator of the presence or absence of survivable space within the structure. This is supported in both the controlled laboratory setting and in field experiments in single-family dwellings. We must keep these things in mind as we determine the best way to employ our tactics so that we can give potentially trapped occupants the best chance of survival. Use this menu to navigate the content